Welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor, and this particular series deals with looking at your subject and assessing any problems or challenges that might be particular to the subject before you begin, so that you can make a plan or think of a technique that may help you in accomplishing the painting. And this is the scene that from a recent trip to Italy. The town is Bergamo, and we're standing on Upper Bergamo, Bergamo Alta, and looking down upon Bergamo Basso, which is the lower section, and we're looking from the fortress wall which surrounds the city. Gives us some unique panoramas. Here's the group. We're looking out over the city, as you can tell. And there's our motif, this bell tower, behind some of the buildings that line up and lead to the bell tower. It was a remarkable day, as you can tell. The light was very intense. This is practically at the golden hour, where light is low, intense. There's a bit of humidity in the air, and so there's this wonderful glow to the city and softness behind. Well, I'm going to start with an exercise, not an exercise, but a warm-up. I do this very often before beginning a project, especially if I've got some problems that I'm not quite sure about. I have a general idea on how to plan my strategy in working out this subject, which is a very complex subject. As you gathered from looking at the rooftops, the complexity is very high, and what I would like to do is think of these rooftops in terms of a pattern, a repeating shape, and that repeating shape is basically the shape of a rooftop, maybe a rectangle that's been distorted a little bit or coming at a different angle to the others, but basically a layering or a progression of rooftops. This pattern is going to be made up of those shapes, and this pattern is going to go from a larger representation of that rooftop to a smaller representation of that rooftop. Now, in this tonal study, I'm using sepia. I'm using Arches 140 rough. It's the paper I favor. I've got my board at 30 degrees so that there's some gravity at work. And you can tell that I'm painting around these white shapes that I have lightly sketched in, but I want to see the pattern in front of my eyes before I do anything else to the rooftops. So as I'm placing these strokes, I'm very aware of how the shapes grow as they come towards us, how we have some vertical shapes too that are basically pathways or streets that lead into the city, and those are going to be in shadow, quite dark, but the rooftops themselves are going to be left as light areas. And in this state, in this particular stage of the painting, it probably just looks like floating pieces of ice. There's not much there to really give us the sense that this is going to be a city, but I hope you see the pattern and you see there's some thoughts towards going from large to small, and also the way that these shapes angle in towards the bell tower. In this case, the bell tower is kind of the apex or the fulcrum of these rooftops, and all of these horizontal shapes, horizontal lines or oblique lines, there's going to be one major vertical, and that's going to be the bell tower. This forms the composition that we might call a T or a cross, where there's a meeting of a strong horizontal. That would be the horizon, and a strong vertical, which would be the bell tower. This, where they meet, creates a natural, very strong center of interest, kind of pulls our attention there. So that will underlie the painting, that will underlie all the buildings and textures and details that we add later. But in doing this exercise, I've come to learn that starting with a very simple, broad view is essential. And that was in my drawing, and as I'm moving now, I'm starting to refine that a little bit, but basically using a graded wash to help bring drama to the foreground and midground, as well as create softness in the background. At the moment, the rooftops are all in the same plane. They're very flat, and there's no feeling that they recede, except for the size. But I'm counting on another application of color to help me do that. So while this this graded wash, is still wet, I'm adding some stronger touches to give us a little feeling of a softer part of the city that's in the background. Maybe a few more towers, maybe a tree or something like this. Anyway, to give us some interest back there. We don't want a hard line. I don't want a hard line because that hard line will draw too much attention, and I also want to communicate that it's a humid day, that there's some smoke or smog or thickness to the air, and that will be the result once if I create that softness in the distance. What you see me doing now is adjusting some of those whites. I'm adding, well, actually what I'm doing is dragging a little bit of water across the wash so that it loosens the wash and dulls down some of the mid-level rooftops. And already you can start to feel a haze or a fog or a sensation of atmosphere. That's probably the best way to term this, is there's a feeling of atmosphere because of that. The rooftops in the foreground remain bright, they remain hard-edged, they remain large, and that in juxtaposition with the rooftops towards the back, you start to feel a distance, a sense of distance, and you feel you're above this display because of the way that we've angled our rooftops towards the horizon and the way that we've allowed them to grow in size. So we definitely feel like we're standing above it all. A lot of the accuracy of this, or the success of this, does depend on good drawing and being able to guesstimate the angles and see the broader picture. So that's why I made an effort to show you through the drawing and the initial placement of these shapes that it starts from a very simple idea. And if you find yourself getting hung up on a specific area or a specific rooftop or a chimney or a window, you know that you're off course at this stage. You should be really thinking in broad terms of the pattern of rooftops, how it grows from large to small, how the edges are important to communicate depth. Anyway, this idea of working with a pattern is so useful when it comes to working in nature or working with complex scenes. I use it again and again to help me to start from a point of simplicity and the point of sort of a broad vision, and give myself a foundation for adding detail. It's not, I don't want to diminish the value of detail. The detail is what gives the finish and the nuance and everything else, but to have that foundation in place is absolutely necessary. So I start with the lines that you saw in my drawing. I start with those angled lines. I start with placing, sometimes accurately, sometimes very broadly, these shapes of rooftops. And now I'm at the stage where in this sketch, in this kind of precursor to the next painting, I'm at the stage where I'm adding some details. You see the chimneys have appeared. I'm starting to place darker colors now in the foreground to give a sensation of the road that we're moving through, or that our eye is that leads towards the bell tower. And I'll build on this. I'll start to use this darker tone to create the cavernous quality of the scene. And it really helps me, and I know it helps my students, and I'm sure it will help you to warm up with a single color study. In general, it's much more fluid. We don't have as many decisions to make. We're thinking in terms of light and dark, which is so crucial to our painting. It's never a waste of time to do one of these. In fact, sometimes these studies come out exceedingly well and become pieces that you're happy to show or happy to sell. But for our case, from my point of view, this is a study. This is a beginning to a complex scene, and it's giving me a clear idea on how to progress with the painting that we do later. In this case, our biggest challenge when we stood upon the rooftop was to sort of see the underlying lines and shapes that formed rooftops and formed streets and formed bell towers, to see them as lines and shapes in the beginning, and then to establish that to where we could read it in looking at our painting. Once we can see it in our own painting, it becomes much easier to go forward. It's that sort of abstraction that is very challenging to the artist, to stand in front of nature and to not see a tree, not see a mountain, but to see a shape and see it very plainly so that you can bring it to the paper. Adding to that shape and giving it form, giving it the qualities of a rooftop or a mountain or a tree or whatever, becomes the next stage and becomes much easier if you can place it first and foremost as a shape. Well, this came at the end of our day, this painting. We are traveling in Bergamo the whole day as part of our northern Italian watercolor workshop. And it was quite a pleasant place to paint because we are out of the mainstream. There were maybe half a dozen people who walked by in the 2 hours that we are painting. And so it was a very calm and reflective time. Anyway, this is the conclusion to my study, and it's still very raw, still very plain, but I hope you can see in this how I've captured the feeling of rooftops, looking down on rooftops, with simple shapes, with a pattern primarily made of simple shapes, and the washes of a graded wash and a deeper wash in the foreground. So now I'm back in the studio, and I want to translate this into a painting. I'm clarifying some of the lines so that you can see the foundation of all of this. The lines that I'm making, first and foremost, the horizon line high in the paper. Second are these angled lines, which are basically the lines that the rooftops fall on. I have a few big rooftops in the foreground that I'm going to key on and give them a little more detail, a little more nuance, so we imply that then to the rest of the rooftops. Work a little bit on getting some accuracy to the bell tower because it's a very important part of the piece and something that we want to use as a focal point. But how much detail to add now? I could add windows, I could add all sorts of details, but those are not as important as the main lines, which are giving my strokes some direction. And I think what I'm going to do a little differently in this piece is actually give a coating of color to the rooftops. So you can see what I'm seeing when I look at them. I see them as one joined shape, and it'd be useful for the painting and useful for communicating this idea if I give them a single color. So let's do that. I'm going to use sort of an orangey sienna mix to start off these rooftops, and I'm not painting them as a solid, but more as I'm leaving some rough brushworks because it's something that I want to see in the finished piece. If you finish this video and like it, you can see a little PDF that accompanies this that's on my website. All the details you can find in the description, so I recommend you look at the description after you look at the video. So look at this join shape. We don't see individual rooftops yet. We just see this floating orange color. But later on, I'm going to bring down some darker hues, playing primarily blue against orange, two complementary hues will form sort of the color nature of this work, but they will start to divide this larger shape so that we see individual rooftops. So this is an important stage, both in looking at your subject and ascertaining the larger picture, and in giving yourself a visible reference in your own painting, because sooner or later we're going to be just looking at our painting. We want to be able to see the rooftops in our painting before we place them, so it's important to have this large shape in place before we start dividing. Well, now you can see I'm introducing that blue in terms of a wet wash. And here's an interesting part of the puzzle for me is to leave, when I start to sense the city beginning, I start leaving little shapes. I carry down the wash, yes, that blue is starting to come down, and now you can see it's starting to divide the city into some distant buildings. These may remain, these may become further changed as I paint further down, or as I return to that back section. But right now, I think because I'm leaving them unpainted with this beautiful blue-violet color surrounding them, you can see the distant rooftops and chimneys starting to emerge almost in a mist. So this is an important stage. The paper's dry. You can tell because I'm getting hard edges. And I'm starting to pull this down now and isolating. I am seeing my drawing, and I'm playing off of the drawing and that large orange shape at the same time, and starting to divide it, but thinking, okay, these rooftops are getting bigger as they come forward. I'm looking for some interesting varieties in the angles. I'm trying to preserve, certainly where we see a major shape, like in front of the bell tower, we have some pitched roofs that I want to be prominent. So I'm leaving some white of the paper there. But I keep carrying down this wash. It's still very wet, as you can tell, so I have time to perhaps now return with a little darker color, some of that darker violet, and create a little distant view of the city. This would be in the form of maybe some other towers or some trees, or just a sense that the city continues further back. And this is done with a technique dry into wet, where my brush is relatively dry. It's got thicker pigment on it, and I'm placing it into that wet blue area. So it's very diffuse, dissolves very quickly, and the result, you'll see, gives us a very soft and distant view of the city. So there's a lot of complexity woven into these techniques, and I'm trying to explain it as I go so that you might be able to incorporate that into the complex scenes that you're painting. So that blue, I'm going to be continuing to bring it down. It's actually more of a violet hue now with a lot of blue mixed in, but I'll be bringing that down as soon as I'm, relatively satisfied with this one area, this area of the fulcrum and the midground where I have my focal area. Actually, at this point, I can start to see the painting in my mind's eye. So I don't have, I can pretty much put away my image source, my sketch, and start to paint just based on what's happening within my painting. That's an important stage for me, is starting to see in my painting, starting to see at this stage in my painting, starting to see a finished goal or a finished result. That gives me a lot of freedom and confidence, and that confidence actually is what translates into spontaneity or vivid brushwork, lively brushwork, is when you can see the mark and how it's going to result before you make it. So that's starting to reveal itself as I'm painting now. I can see that I need to carry down this violet through the lower section, through some of the shadowed areas on the left-hand side, and join it to the violet that's above. That's what I'm doing now, as I'm starting to place a deeper aspect, but basically joining it to the mid-tone, that darker area that's winding through the streets, and isolating a few of the rooftops back there. Also creates that feeling of lanes or streets, divided parts of the city. And if you notice, these parts kind of lead to the bell tower. And I'm still leaving a lot of white. I know that won't be the end result. Right now, some of those midground whites are standing out perhaps a little too strongly, but it's my intention, my goal, to return to these at some point, probably after it's dried, and just add with a wet brush and soften some of that area, or perhaps add just a little bit of light warmth to there, so that they feel like they're sunstruck, but they're really receding into that soft purple haze. Now you see some rooftops being divided, but you still have a feeling of that large integrated shape of rooftops, made up of many rooftops, but painted as one. So we're starting to think a little bit about the detail. I've explored adding some stronger sienna orange hues to create the feeling of tiles on this near rooftop with dry brush. But I think it's time to kind of drop in the top of the steeple and get that in place, and then we can start to relate the rest of our painting to the steeple. Trying to get some accuracy, because I really fell in love with the town of Bergamo and all of the beautiful architecture that's a part of the city. You can climb much higher than we are right now and look from a high point all the way down, but I don't think we could paint up there, and actually it would probably be, for me, it would be a little tricky because I don't care for heights that much. Standing on this wall looking down to the city is just right for me. And anyway, we had quiet spot here. We also had shade, so when you're working outside, some things take priority. Of course, you want to be in proximity to your subject so that you can really see it and play off of it, but sometimes having a quiet area with shade is an equal consideration. And we had all of those today, so we were very fortunate, I feel, and had a wonderful day up in the Bergamo Alta. There's a cute little figure up there with it appeared to be a bow to me. I'm sure he has some sort of mythological reference to Bergamo. As I understood, Bergamo was the westernmost location of the Venetian Empire, and it's a UNESCO site, and you can see so many excellent examples of architecture within the city walls. The gateway is beautiful. The way it's kept, all the chestnut trees and plantings that they have there are just made for painting. So if you haven't visited there, I can give you a few tips. I can also give you a few restaurants that I fell in love with. Don't want to make myself hungry while I'm doing this video because that'll distract me. Anyway, you can see I'm working with a little more sienna, a little more of that orange hue that I started with, and I keep going back and forth between blue and orange, and sometimes mixing them as I did in the lower section, and keeping the color, the palette, very simple. I do this more and more because I find it gives my paintings a little more visual integrity, and I'm fond of more of a tonal approach to begin with, so working with a limited palette is always in line with that. And I guess what I can say at this stage is we are getting into the detail of the city, and at this point it becomes a matter of how much detail. And since I'm narrating with hindsight, I may have done a little too much detail. I don't know. I'm still very fond of the painting. It has a little more detail than is typical of my work, but I feel it was worthy stuff. Anyway, what I'm doing now is being selective about where I add these sienna accents. I don't want to just add it everywhere. I want it to have some purpose, and that purpose is to pull the painting forward in certain spots and to give a definitive edge in certain spots, and then I counter that with some blurred edges or soft edges. So this sort of counterpoint between soft and hard, between warm and cool, between light and dark, are really at the center of establishing depth in the painting and creating a cohesive and entertaining image, beautiful image. Some dry brush here for the rooftops. You can see how the left white really starts to have a power in the background. We have some pure paper far away, but it really calls out to us and seems to glow back there. Anyway, this particular tutorial or video is focused on taking a very complex subject and finding an approach, because when we stand in front of it, we're often overwhelmed. We almost become numb or unable to focus because there's so much to look at. One of the first things we do that I do is choose a kind of focal area, an area that I want to carry the eye to, and I build outward from there, or I look outward from there and decide how much is necessary, and try to find an interesting combination of shapes And that combination of shapes remains sort of the foundation and the, I would say, the beautiful part of this painting. You can tell I'm returning now and softening some of those edges back there. That white that I was talking about earlier has almost become, well, has become reduced because of some blurring, and it's allowed the bell tower and these near buildings to come forward a little more. I'm returning now to some chimneys and rooftops. Probably for the remainder of this tutorial is going to be to add and adjust small things to the painting, because you can tell it's 90% complete, maybe even 95% complete. I want to add some windows. I want to give some highlights here and there to the chimneys, but it's pretty much minor stuff. I would say minor stuff used to kind of augment the strength or the main foundation of the painting, which is already there. When you're trying to ascertain a pattern, as I have done in these rooftops, one question you can ask yourself, and the answer should come pretty quick, is what's the repeating shape? What shape is creating the pattern? In this case, the shape of the rooftop was basically a rectangle, and that rectangle is repeated and distorted and joined with other rectangles to form that pattern. And whatever subject you're looking at, a flower, a tree, a busy area, an area that might seem just overwhelmingly complex, if you think of it in terms of a pattern, and if you can find that repeating shape, you are just miles ahead. You're ready. That will give you such an advantage. Then it becomes a matter of distributing those shapes in a way that's going to create depth and give your painting some feeling of realistic quality, and that should come about rather naturally if you can ascertain the shapes that are repeated. So yeah, what we're doing in essence at this point is we're coming back to that complex impression, that first impression we had of a beautiful complexity. But we've done it very much in a methodical, pragmatic fashion of creating an array of shapes and a pattern that now we build upon, and we augment, and we add detail, and we make it more complex, and we hide that structure. It's there, but we break it, or we soften it, and we make it less obvious. You can think of that sort of as a armature, that initial pattern of rooftops as an armature, similar to what a wax sculptor may use to create a figure. That armature is primarily a wire stick figure, and on top of that the sculptor will add clay or wax to create a full three-dimensional figure. And the armature is always there, but you see it less and less as the figure comes into being, and at some point you're completely unaware of it, and you're seeing it only as a figure. You're not seeing that initial support that the figure is hung upon. It's very similar to what we're doing today. If you review this video, you'll see and understand that it's all based on a pattern of shapes and patterns. And look at the brush is really become small now. This is one of the smaller brushes that I'll work with, just to add some details, and I'm testing to see how much I can add and not confuse the eye. I realize that it's a fine line. You really have to be careful. Too much detail will kind of overburden it and distract the eye, especially in these corners. The corners of the painting are areas where it's beneficial to be a little vague. Almost, you can think like you're painting a vignette, and we want an entrance to the painting, but we don't want the eye to be taken to the corners too easily. We should kind of float around there and be drawn more towards our focal point in terms of, I'm speaking in terms of composition now. And you can see in this painting, I could put a lot of detail into those corners, but I'm purposely staying away from that. Well, I realized that since the painting is drawn, this lower section is lightened a little too much, and I want to reestablish the feeling of these forward buildings and shadows being cast across them. I want to do that simply, and I don't want to distract too much from my main center of interest. I want to have a good relationship between the foreground, which is perhaps the first couple of inches, 3 inches of this piece, and the midground where is my stage is. Even in such a painting where we have a sort of a plane of shapes, and it's not clear where the foreground begins and the midground begins. Even in such an image, it helps to have that in our thoughts, because we make adjustments as the painting finishes to create a little sharper attraction in the midground, or we soften the corners or soften this foreground a little bit, the front buildings, to make it feel more like a finished painting. Some more details, a lot of details. How many details can I force upon this painting and still have it be enjoyable? It's starting to get to the point where I don't want to do anymore. And the reason I'm adding these little bits is just to give some feeling of depth in the shadows, some feeling of transparency to the shadows. Maybe add a highlight here and there where I feel I've lost the brightness that I once had, or to give an accent to the side of a chimney that's getting light. In this case, to soften a corner and make it a little more easy on the eyes. It's an interesting point. Where do you stop? Where do you turn away? I recall a story that Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, the philosopher, and in this story, it's the student talking to the master artist, and the student is asking the master, "So when do I know the painting's finished?" And the master says, "When it looks like you didn't do it." And Sartre had an interesting take on it and a lot of truth in what he was saying. Anyway, this is the finished piece. This is as far as I will go on this view of Bergamo Basso from Bergamo Alta, looking off of the fortified bridge, not the bridge, the wall, the fortress wall that circled the city, protected the city, looking down upon the city. And it still has that old world charm, doesn't it? It's all tiled roofs and cathedrals and the tops of churches. And it has a soft quality to it, as though we're looking through some humid air. The direction of light is pretty clear. But let's remember, this all began with a simplification of shapes, seeing our subject in terms of simple shapes and a pattern of repeated shapes. That's the problem that we faced, is how to simplify our subject, and this is the solution that I chose. So I hope it was helpful for you. Again, if you would like more information on this subject, there's a small PDF that accompanies this, and you can find a link in the description. You can find other links in the description to my website, to Instagram, to other supporting documents. And thank you for liking this video.